The Bride of Frankenstein, released in 1935, was the direct sequel to the 1931 film Frankenstein, based on the novel of the same name by Mary Shelley, and was directed by James Whale, who returns after doing the first movie. The film has garnered a legacy of great significance, about as much so, or perhaps even more so, than its predecessor. It was the progenitor of film sequels, and it is often considered to be one of the best sequels ever made, with many arguing that it even surpasses the original. For this video, I will be discussing on the matter on how and why the film had earned such a legacy, as well as to see whether or not it would actually be as good or better than the first movie. No sense beating around the bush, let's get into it. So to start things off, I think it makes sense to go into a bit of a summary for this film here. The Bride of Frankenstein picks up immediately where the first film left off, detailing that the monster, played by Boris Karloff, who was created by Dr. Henry Frankenstein, had escaped a fiery demise and tries to escape the villagers who want him dead, while continuing to seek companionship in order to find himself a life worth living. Meanwhile, Henry Frankenstein, played by Colin Clive, is approached by the devious Dr. Septimus Pretorius, played by Ernest Thesiger, to create a mate, or a bride, one might say, for the monster. Eventually, these two storylines converge, and the film culminates in the creation of the bride herself. The film has a strong storyline that also features some very strong character work. The first character to go into would be Henry Frankenstein. In this movie, he is depicted as a man who is still haunted by his experiments, making him vulnerable to Dr. Pretorius' influence. However, Elizabeth, played by Valerie Hobson, his wife, serves as his anchor back to a life away from his experiments, as well as his trauma that has stemmed from his failure to have proper control and understanding of the results of his experiments. And this anchor which she represents, and his love and care for her, as well as events that have transpired in the first film, which resulted in him narrowly escaping the clutches of death, give him the pause for thought he needs to realize that further experimentation is just not worth it anymore. And in the instance where he is forced to perform the creation of the monster's mate, it is out of his love for Elizabeth and his need for her to be safe, where he is driven to ensure the success of such an endeavor. Frankenstein has shown to have grown from a scientist who played God to see if he could, to a man who has fully realized his grave mistakes, and who only plays God again reluctantly. After his creation goes on to destroy himself, the bride, and Pretorius, so that he may live, Frankenstein is fully free from his curse, and goes on to hold Elizabeth close in comfort, having learned once and for all from his mistakes of playing God, and vowing to never look back. While Henry Frankenstein isn't quite as prominent in this film as he was in the first, he is still given a fair amount of strong character work, which allows this film to work as a solid conclusion to his arc that's explored over the course of the two films. Also, Colin Clive does very well in portraying the reluctant man of science. While his performance doesn't stand out quite as much as the one he gave in the first film, Clive is still strong in the part. Well, we've talked about one scientist so far, so now let's talk about another, shall we? Septimus Pretorius is a diabolical villain and a classic example of the mad scientist archetype. Ernest Thesiger gives a great performance and brings such a devilish presence to the film anytime he's on screen. While many people out there, such as James Rolfe from Cinemassacre, would consider him as the devil in Frankenstein's shoulder, and understandably so, considering his attempts to, no better way to put it, tempt Frankenstein back into experiments with life and death, I am willing to go as far as to say that Pretorius is the much darker reflection of Frankenstein himself. What a character does, the actions which they commit to doing, are what defines them more than any line of dialogue ever could. The actions and methods which Frankenstein and Pretorius partook in during their respective quests to achieve their scientific endeavors define who they are as people. Both men have sought to conduct their unorthodox experiments just to see if they could, without much thought into whether or not they should. But, whereas Frankenstein wishes to shut people out from his life so that they would not interfere with his experiments, In order to ensure success, Pretorius goes on to force Frankenstein, to force him to be brought in to help him via blackmail. And whereas Frankenstein had only gone as far as to commit literal grave robbery for his experiments, Pretorius is willing to have people killed just to have a more fresh specimen in order to make progress, such as when Frankenstein required a healthy heart so that they could maintain a stable frequency of heartbeats. Pretorius is willing to commit insidious deeds or have his minions commit such deeds, all in the name of science. One might say that Pretorius was a bit of a precursor for Peter Cushing's portrayal of Dr. Frankenstein in the Frankenstein films produced by Hammer. Pretorius is a strong antagonist and a more than worthy addition to the story of the film, as well as the greater narrative of both entries in this two-parter, standing as a compelling example of what madness in search of godhood could do to a man. While Frankenstein and Pretorius' side of the story is well done, the side which involves the monster is where the film really shines. We see the monster, after having narrowly survived the burning windmill, struggling to evade the villagers who want him brought to justice, as well as just surviving in general. He then comes across the house where a lonely blind man resides, after hearing the music which he plays from a violin, with the music being a rendition of Ave Maria. The monster is taken in by the blind man, and the two form a friendship. This segment of the film, on top of being wonderfully acted by both Boris Karloff and O.P. Hagee, fully humanizes the monster and sets him on a path where he, as a character, starts to develop. The blind man teaches the monster about food, drink, smoking, even the concept of good and bad, as well as the context that it provides in the case of fire, something which the monster greatly fears and is traumatized by. However, the friendship between the monster and the blind man is cut tragically short when a couple of hunters come and confront the monster, resulting in the blind man's home to be caught ablaze. The monster, desperate to find companionship, meets Pretorius, who proposes to him the prospect of a mate. This gives the monster motive to help Pretorius in strong-arming Frankenstein into working for them. After the bride is created, the monster is under the impression that he may finally have a friend. However, the bride recoils in disgust and rejects him, despite his best efforts to convince her otherwise. With that being the final straw, and seeing how his life, up to that point, had brought him nothing but pain, the monster goes on to sacrifice himself and take Pretorius with him, so that Frankenstein can live a life worth, well, living. The monster is more than well realized as a character, and the addition of dialogue for him really adds to his nuance. His dialogue is simple, yet so layered with pathos. Even with only a few words spoken, there is so much to understand about his emotional state and what's on his mind. Especially when given the context of events from the previous film, the monster becomes incredibly sympathetic, as he has had nothing to show for but physical and emotional scars, and all he wants is to be accepted, to find solace, and to be loved and happy. Yet he is forced to strike back against a society that sees him as nothing but an abomination for things that weren't his fault. Had he been treated better as more than just an experiment the moment he was brought into the world, perhaps things would have been different. However, the monster's life is a tragic one, and to see him put an end to it all so that his creator could live further adds to the tragedy, albeit with a sense that he had found some level of solace at the very least. Granted, this would be somewhat undone by future entries in the Frankenstein franchise, but the ending of this film still gives what could easily have been strong closure for Frankenstein's monster. And once again, Boris Karloff brings so much life and power to the role, to where his performance throughout the film indelibly cemented him as the definitive portrayal of Frankenstein's monster. And it's hard to imagine a better portrayal of such a powerful character. Now, after hearing me go on about that, you might be wondering if there's any other characters that are worth discussing about this film. Well, I do have a couple more. Elizabeth Lavenza, played by Valerie Hobson, also has more going on as a character in this film than in the first. The film gives us a scene in the beginning of its story where she expresses her emotional trauma to her beloved as a result of her encounter with the monster, leveraging the dramatic potential left by the first film for a successor to work with. As I previously mentioned, she also serves well as an anchor for Frankenstein to move on from his experiments. For the rest of the film, however, she does end up becoming not much more than a damsel in distress when the monster and Pretorius kidnap her in order to blackmail Frankenstein into creating the monster's mate, giving Frankenstein a strong motivation to go through with it and to try to power through his trauma in the name of love. And while it's pretty peculiar that Mae Clarke, who played Elizabeth in the first film, didn't reprise her role here, Valerie Hobson still gives a solid performance in this film overall. So now that leaves us with just one more character worth discussing in this film, and that is the Bride of Frankenstein herself, played by Elsa Lanchester, who also plays Mary Shelley, the author of the book Frankenstein, in a prologue bit in the film. Despite her rather limited screen time, which all takes place near the tail end of the film, the bride still has a decent amount of character work added to her. Much like Frankenstein's monster, she is a being that has been thrusted into existence by a man who sought to create her so that, as another man once said, he would know what it feels like to be God. However, what sets the bride apart from her intended groom is that she was created to have a particular role thrusted upon her, a role which she had no understanding of and gave no consent for. When she meets the monster, she rejects him out of fear for her life due to his appearance, a result which was never intended by Frankenstein or Pretorius especially. In the first film, the monster was created because Henry Frankenstein wanted to see if he could. Then, after the experiment was proven to be a success, the first time the monster appeared, he was being taught by his creator to do things and behave like a man. There wasn't a strongly apparent endgame in mind beyond having the monster learn about the world and how to be a person. Meanwhile, we see the bride having a role forced upon her which she has no conception of, thus prompting her to go into the defensive and reject the monster as well as rejecting the purpose of her own existence. She then perishes in the exploding laboratory along with the monster and Pretorius, for she and the monster, as one may put it, belong dead. Even with her short tenure on screen, despite being the title character of the film, there is still a fair amount of nuance in the bride as a character. Not to mention, Elsa Lanchester gives an iconic performance where she expertly conveys the character's uneasy state of mind and emotions in her one big scene. So yeah, long story short, character work. Good. Moving right along, we see that the film is not just strong in terms of storytelling, but it is also well put together in the technical side of things. The set design is fantastic, from Frankenstein's mansion, to the monster's prison cell, to Frankenstein's laboratory, which makes a return in the film's third act, with a few new tweaks added in, as demonstrated in the bride's creation sequence. The cinematography is also great, showing off the full scope of the environments in which certain scenes are taking place, such as the wooded area and the cemetery where the monster traverses through, as he is being pursued by villagers. The film is pretty much a technical marvel from top to bottom, especially as a film from 1935. Kudos to James Whale and crew in regards to all that. Also, the makeup work by Jack Pierce is stellar, just as it was in the first film. Not only does the film give us yet another iconic and classic look in the bride herself, but it also gives us the monster's makeup of burn marks and scars which are applied and executed expertly well, as they showcase the hell that he had gone through as a result of the end of the first film. There is also a really neat touch of how the monster's wounds heal up over time as the film progresses. Great stuff, I have to say. Now, if there is anything to say about this film that is off, or at least would be considered to be a mixed bag, there are some questionable bits of continuity here and there. While they don't break the movie, they are certainly noticeable. For instance, the father of Maria, the little girl who drowned in the first film at the hands of the monster, albeit accidentally, returns in this film. However, he bears no resemblance to how he appeared in the first film. In fact, even his name is different. In the first film, he was a younger man who at no point was ever seen with a cane, which would typically be needed for walking. and his name in the first movie was Ludwig. In Bride of Frankenstein, however, it's like he aged about 30 years within the time span of, well, however long it took for the windmill to be burnt completely down, requires a cane for traversal as a result, and his name changed from Ludwig to Hans. He certainly comes off as the same character due to his congruent behavior of wanting to see if the monster who killed his daughter is truly dead. However, considering that this film is supposed to pick up right where the first film left off, it's strange that the filmmakers didn't have access to any sort of archives from the previous film. Like, let's just say a copy of its script perhaps, so that the transition from the first film to the next goes without a hitch. However, despite this being a pretty noticeable error in continuity, it's pretty minor compared to how the Burgomaster is portrayed in this film. In the first film, the Burgomaster, Herr Vogel, played by Lionel Belmore, is portrayed as pretty jovial, but shown to be competent and willing and able to take immediate action when a crime such as child murder is committed. He's even one of the many witnesses and even one of the lead participants of the burning of the windmill, where he would have a good reason to believe the monster would be dead by the end. In Bride of Frankenstein, he's played by E. Clive, who bears no resemblance to Belmore, the actor who played this character in the first film, though this is rather minor when compared to how this character is portrayed in the writing side of things, which is a lot more important, by the way. In this film, he is portrayed as rather dismissive of the monster's potency and sheer resilience, literally tush-tushing the matter aside, and is last seen casually telling people to calm down before running away with them when the monster escapes his cell. Yet we are supposed to consider this version of the Burgomaster and the one in the first film to be the same guy, 1-to-1. Not great, let's just say, and it's even kind of worse when this film's story begins right where the first film's story ends. Considering that throughout history in a town or city-state there can only be one Burgomaster or head of town, there isn't even enough wiggle room to assume that Frankenstein's town has more than one Burgomaster. So yeah, they kind of fumbled the ball regarding the Burgomaster in this film. It's as if he's not even the same person as he was in the first film due to his incongruent portrayal. And while he is still a side character in this film, just as he was in the first film at the end of the day, that does not excuse his inconsistent portrayals from one film to another. It is also kind of odd that Victor Moritz and Baron Frankenstein, Henry's friend and father respectively, aren't even present in the film, especially when those two characters would very much have a vested interest in seeing if Henry is doing okay. It would have been nice if this film at the very least had addressed their absence, especially considering that either one of those characters or both of them could have had somewhat of an impact on the story. So while these little goofs in continuity aren't enough to break the film, they still bring it down a bit, especially considering that, as I keep iterating, the film is supposed to pick up right where the first film left off. So it seems like that we've covered just about everything that I wish to cover, so let's get right into the conclusion of this video. In the end, The Bride of Frankenstein is considered to be a classic by many, and for very good reasons. From great directorial prowess in the technical side of filmmaking, to fantastic acting from the cast all the way around, to a compelling and well-told story that features great character work, it stands as a worthy sequel to Frankenstein 1931. There are still some lapses in continuity that would make the experience of watching it and its predecessor back-to-back kinda awkward, which as a result keeps me from deeming this film as superior to the first film. Nonetheless, Bride of Frankenstein is still overall an objectively good film in terms of filmmaking, both as a sequel and as a film on its own. I certainly recommend other entries in the Universal Classic Monsters catalog, including but not limited to Dracula, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, the Wolfman, and the Invisible Man, but I am more than willing to consider the first two Frankenstein films as among the strongest entries in the franchise's all-time history. And they're certainly among my favorite films in that catalog as well. So that just about does it for this essay video. I would like to thank you all very much for watching. Considering that I did a video on Frankenstein 1931 back in October of 2021, an essay video on The Bride of Frankenstein was bound to happen. In fact, one might say it was almost inevitable. I'll certainly be doing more videos on various Universal Monsters films in the future, and perhaps I won't limit them to just October releases. Nonetheless, I definitely wanted to do these two Frankenstein films, especially as Halloween-themed videos. And as far as what I have next in store, well, I'm very certain that I will let you all know what I'll be putting, or rather, stitching together, before too long. Once again, I thank you all for watching, and until my next video or series of videos, I will see you all later. Happy Halloween.